Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce Mike. He's got over 20 years experience growing mushrooms, so I'm excited to learn a lot about that today. So, Mike.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Growing and selling shiitake mushrooms is the name of my session. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background, about myself. We have a 122-acre farm about 10 minutes from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And our primary business at the farm is we have an organic heirloom seed company, and we have a booth outside here. But we do a lot of things on the farm. We're always trying to diversify more and more. And as a lot of you folks probably realize, especially after a year like 2019, where we were all underwater in the spring for a long time, it's a good idea to diversify and have other crops that you can grow that will do well in those off years when Mother Nature throws you some interesting weather. So on our farm, we have the seed farm, and then we also grow some vegetables, some fruit. We have a fruit nursery. We grow shiitake mushrooms. This past year, for the first time, we grew some certified organic hemp for seed. So we have hemp seed. The way we pay for the whole farm is, like most farmers, we have an outside job. We have a landscaping business. We do organic, sort of high-end gardening in the Ann Arbor area. We also rent some of our hay fields. We do some educational programs on the farm. We rent some space on the farm through a website called Hip Camp, which is kind of like Airbnb for hippie campers. So these are all different ways that you can diversify your farm. Seems like Iowa could probably use a little diversification. Iowa seems great, everyone. I just see a lot of corn and soy farmers here, so I'm like, okay, that's not the only way to make a living. So, so a little about me. So we'll just jump right into it. History of growing mushrooms on logs. People have been cultivating shiitake mushrooms for over 800 years. Some people think it might even be as long as 3,000 years. There are written records of them being consumed as early as 199 AD, and records of cultivation during the Song Dynasty in China from 960 to 1127 AD. So this was probably first done just by taking a piece of a log that had the mushroom mycelium in it, cutting a hole in another log, and just sort of transferring it over. And then over time, that technique was refined. So pure spawn cultures, like in a sterile lab, were first developed in the 1920s. I'm mostly going to be talking about shiitake in this talk. I have a little bit of experience growing other mushrooms, but honestly, shiitake is the only one that I've been able to successfully make an income off of. There are plenty of other folks out there that know more about oysters or various other species. And at the end of the lecture, I'll touch on some of the other log-grown mushrooms, but mostly my experience is with shiitake. So let's see. So an improvement on some of the earlier methods, we're using wedges and then wafers to inoculate logs. Now we use wooden dowel plugs for best results. And so what that means is someone who owns a mushroom lab, which I don't. I do everything low-tech, outdoors. I'm not making my own spawn. I thought, when I was invited for this talk, I thought, that makes sense. It's the Practical Farmers Conference. Most of you are probably not going to start your own mushroom labs. Someday I'd like to, but you really don't need your own lab to grow shiitakes. You can just, the plugs are not very expensive to purchase. And so that's what I recommend. So basically, they take little wooden dowels and they inoculate them with the mushroom mycelium in a lab, and then you know exactly what strain you're getting, and it's very predictable what the results are. So shiitake is believed to be the first domesticated mushroom, and it's currently the second most cultivated species of mushroom. Does anyone know what the first one is? Well, it would be the white button mushroom, Agaricus bisporus, which I should tell you all, you might see them served raw on salad bars. It's never a good idea to eat a mushroom. Generally, you always want to, when someone asks you if someone asks you if a mushroom is edible, I like to say this mushroom is edible most of the time for most people when properly cooked. So I do not eat, and you should not eat, white button mushrooms raw, even if they throw them on salad bars. There are carcinogenic compounds in a lot of mushrooms that need to be cooked off. And then once they're cooked, they're fine, but it's not a great idea to eat them raw. So being able to grow mushrooms via wooden dowels, or sometimes people use sawdust that's been inoculated with the mycelium, it's greatly increased the efficiency of cultivating mushrooms and also decreases the rate of contamination. So we've really had some big breakthroughs in the last 100 years or so on how to do this. Increased water management, like soaking the logs as a way of forcing them, is a great way to increase your yields and just have more predictability. So generally it takes about 9 to 12 months after you've inoculated before you'll get your first mushrooms. It could be as early as 6 months, but it usually takes about 12 to 18 months before you'll get your first really big yield off of your logs. So urban mushroom farming is a great thing in some cases. In a lot of urban environments, you don't necessarily have the wide open spaces of farmland, so you can have a vegetable garden or something, but it's hard to really do like large scale production. But mushroom growing is something that really lends itself well to the city because you don't need a lot of space. And, there's a lot of shady spots on the north sides of buildings and things like that. Of course, you do have to be careful in the urban environment because mushrooms tend to be dynamic accumulators, so they pick up heavy metals and that sort of thing. So you don't really want to grow mushrooms in heavily contaminated areas. It's probably okay to do it on logs in urban environments that are a little bit contaminated because mostly they're getting the nutrition from the log itself. But with other species of mushrooms that you might grow in the ground and such, you really have to be careful with, lead contamination and that kind of thing. So I just urge you to be cautious if you're in the city, but it's also a good idea to try this on a small scale in the city. The other thing about mushrooms is they really have a diversified nutritional profile, and so it's a great thing for people to add to their diet. If a lot of Americans do not eat many mushrooms, there's going to be a lot of growth in mushroom consumption in this country over the next few decades. So getting good at growing mushrooms is a pretty good idea because they generally command a fairly high price compared to vegetables, and people should eat more mushrooms in their diet. Some of the dietary benefits of mushrooms: they're high in fiber, they're rich in protein, especially shiitake is much higher in protein than any of the other mushrooms. They're rich in polysaccharides, low in fat, have simple carbohydrates, and they're a good source of many B vitamins and minerals. They're also one of the only produce items to contain vitamin D. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in the lecture. Some varieties have been proven to have medicinal health benefits, including the ability to lower serum cholesterol and inhibit malignant tumors. There's some pretty good science out there about that stuff. And in Asian countries, shiitake, reishi, turkey tail, and maitake are used to treat cancer, leukemia, hypertension, immunodeficiency diseases, and a host of other maladies. I'm not making these claims. I'm just saying that in Asian countries, that's what they believe that they do. And there's certainly a lot of research that may support that. So then we'll just jump into the cultivation part because I know you're all eager to hear about how to actually do this. So it's important to have an understanding of the ecology of the mushroom that you're growing. Saprophytic fungi, which simply means an organism that gets its energy from non-living organic matter, such as decaying pieces of plants or animals, for example, fungi, bacteria, protozoa. So saprophytic fungi are the best to use for home cultivation of mushrooms. It's important to always start with good spawn from a reputable spawn provider, such as Easy Grow Mushrooms. I just say that because that's a friend of mine back in Michigan who owns that, Chris Wright. He's a really amazing mycologist. I recommend getting spawn from him. I have some other recommendations later in the lecture too. So it really does require an investment of time and labor. It's not that hard to grow shiitakes. Any one of you can do it. It's more manual labor than it is technical once you're outside and out of the lab. It's just really important to always try to keep everything as clean as you can, your hands, your tools. You don't need things to be sterile, but you don't want to contaminate your spawn as you're inoculating and that sort of thing. If you drop your plugs on the ground, you don't want to pick them up and use them. You just sort of let them lie. So the first thing is you have to source your logs. Okay, so you grow shiitakes on logs, preferably oak logs, and they need to be freshly cut, preferably during the winter, and they need to be disease-free. So usually you go for 3 to 8 inches in diameter. You can do any length, but I tend to like 3 to 4 feet in length, just because anything bigger and I can't really move it around. So there's a lot of fresh logs available in the urban environment, as well as suburban and rural environments, but a lot of trees get taken down in the city. So if you're friends with a tree trimmer or someone that's taking down trees, that's a good way to source logs. So you do have to explain to your log provider what you want, though. Like, you do not want diseased logs. You don't want logs that have some of the bark scraped off of it, because the bark is the most important part of the log. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. You definitely want fresh logs. Question? 3 to 8 inches in diameter is the ideal. Anything less than 3, and they just don't last that long and they don't produce that much. And anything greater than 8 inches is really heavy to work with and doesn't generally produce more than a log of a lesser diameter. It'll still work, but it's just kind of harder to work with. So, so it's really important to make sure that they're not already contaminated once you get them. Shiitake, having been domesticated for so long, is not a particularly aggressive fungus. So you want to make sure that you're taking a live log, which is not exactly sterile, but doesn't necessarily have, contaminants in it. And then you want to get the shiitake spawn into that log quickly and efficiently so that it can colonize the whole log before something else gets it. In the fungi world, it's almost always like whoever gets to it first wins. So other things will get to it if you don't get the shiitakes in there soon enough. Some folks say to inoculate as soon as it's cut. In Japan, there's a tradition of waiting about a month before inoculation, but studies have shown that it's really probably better just to do it right away. Some people even joke you might want to inoculate the tree before you cut it down. It's really important to have good, fresh logs. And if you cut them in the summer, you're not going to get as good of results. In the winter, if you cut a log in the winter, the bark stays on the log better than during the summer. At some point in the spring, when a tree is going to leaf out, the bark starts to slip. I'm sure folks are familiar. If you've cut trees before, you're familiar with that idea of like as soon as the sap starts to flow in the spring, it kind of the bark gets a little looser. It's kind of wet right underneath the surface, and so the bark will fall off more easily if you use logs that are in spring or summer cut. So winter, basically like in the fall, right after the leaves fall. That's the time of year that you can start cutting, and then you can keep cutting until the sap rises in the spring and the bark starts to slip. So when you cut the log, you can kind of look at the rings on the log at the end of the log and just make sure that they don't look contaminated. And generally, you're going to want to monitor and maintain the moisture content of your substrate, your log. So mushrooms are about 90% water by weight, and they require really moist conditions for maximum yield. So your log really should be at an optimal, it should be greater than 35% and less than 50% during fruiting. And I'll show you a way later in the lecture to measure that. I will say, though, that I've almost never actually measured it. I've been doing this for 20 years. And so after a few years, you kind of get a sense of like, is this log light or is it heavy based on how big it is and what kind of wood it is. And you get a sense of like, oh, the logs are too dry. I better water them. I better do something about this. But if you want to be really scientific about it, if you want to monitor it, I do recommend that. It's just it can be time consuming to measure the moisture content of them. So it's important to know your mushrooms, know what a shiitake looks like. Make sure to identify each and every mushroom that you grow before you eat it or offer it to someone else to eat or distribute it. So shiitake should have a brown cap and it should have a white spore print. So make sure that you are positive of what species they are. I have not had anything come out of my shiitake logs that looked anything like shiitake. So far, I haven't had any problems where like there could have been a mix-up, but I have had other things that don't resemble a shiitake, and in those cases, I'm careful to always tell my staff if they're picking that like I need to look at every mushroom before they get sold just to make sure. And after a while, people learn the mushrooms, and then I don't have to worry as much. But you do want to be careful because there are many mushrooms out there, and most of them are not edible, and some of them can be toxic. So you don't want to hurt anybody. So. See. So let's talk about variety selection. There's generally 3 basic varieties of shiitakes. I mean, there's lots of different strains within these groups, but you have your wide range varieties, which will fruit at between 50 and 80 degrees. And then you have your warm weather varieties, which generally fruit between 60 and 88 degrees, and your cold weather varieties that generally fruit between 43 and 73 degrees. So I'm going to assume that Iowa is really similar in climate to Southeast Michigan, where I live, in that we often have hard winters, and then we might have like a week or 2 of spring weather, and then all of a sudden it's summer, and then we don't get like a whole lot in between. And so because of that, I have not had really great luck with the cold weather varieties because it just doesn't stay cool long enough. If I was up in, say, Minnesota or like northern Michigan, I would probably use more cold weather strains, but I generally only have about maybe 10 or 20% of my logs in cold weather strains because usually what happens is the cold weather ones are usually the highest quality ones, or the nicest mushrooms, but they'll start to form in the cold weather, and then all of a sudden it'll be 70, 80 degrees for a few days, and then they'll just kind of dry up, or I just get really small mushrooms. And the warm weather varieties, you tend to get much larger fruiting bodies, and they kind of pop out overnight or in just a couple days, and they get huge, and you get a lot of weight. But the thing is that in the warm weather, I have trouble with slugs, and I have trouble with a few insects, and so I find that during the warm season, I kind of have more trouble with pests, and it's harder to pick firsts, and I don't like selling seconds. And in general, I don't recommend getting into the seconds market because it's kind of a race to the bottom. You want to have the highest quality crop you can. So I might have 10 or 20% warm weather varieties as well, just because it's nice to always have something coming for my buyers. But I'll generally try to have about 80% wide range varieties in Michigan. And I mean, depending on where you live and your climate, you might find a different mix is appropriate. But for Southeast Michigan, that's over 20 years. That's about what I've found. I mean, sometimes I've just thought about, why don't I just do all wide range and forget about these cold weather and warm weather ones? Another disadvantage of the cold weather ones is usually those ones can't be forced, or they're not very responsive to forcing. And so if you want to have like a regular sale each week or every couple of weeks of shiitakes, cold weather, it can be hard to, the cold weather strains can be hard to do that with. So in general, in my mind, I think of like 70s, low 70s during the day and 50s at night with high humidity as being the best conditions for the wide range strains. I just kind of think of that as like shiitake weather, because even the cold weather and the warm weather ones will sometimes fruit under those conditions, between 70 and 50. So then the name shiitake is it's a Japanese name for this mushroom, and I don't speak Japanese, but my limited understanding is that the suffix take means mushroom, and so shi is a tree in Japan that shiitake, essentially evolved on, and it happens to be in the oak family. Well, we don't have any shi trees here in North America, but it seems that they grow really well on oak trees, or anything in the oak family. So white oak is probably the best, but red oak is fine. Any of the other oaks work just fine. The exception would be live oaks. So some of the oaks out west, but pretty much anything here, any kind of oak here would work. You can certainly use these other species on this list, like hard maple and sweet gum, locust and hickory, chestnut, alder, hornbeam, and ironwood. But other than maple, most of those don't really. I'm just not finding that kind of wood. People don't generally want to cut down a 3 to 8 inch, well, any tree really for that matter. But I have not done chestnut. There probably isn't that much chestnut wood out there that people want to cut down and inoculate. But it being so closely related to oaks, I would think that would be probably a very good species. I haven't really tried sweet gum, locust, hickory. I haven't tried those ones. And then hornbeam and ironwood are understory trees, and so you don't see very large trees. They grow pretty slow in the shade, and so I'm not really keen on cutting those down. So usually what I do to get my logs is I'll either find a landowner near me that will let me come and cut logs from their woodlot or out of one of their fields that hasn't been cropped in a while, and it's starting to grow up in trees and they want to keep it open. So we have some relationships like that. We also have some oak on our property, but I try to avoid cutting that because, well, we like our oak trees. Sometimes I'll work with tree trimmers, but kind of stopped doing that because we're certified organic and our inspector needs to, have a chain of custody for the logs. And so we need to be able to prove that nothing was sprayed on or near them. So that's always a challenge is if you're certified organic is like, where are you going to get your logs from? You can have someone sign a letter saying like, okay, this land was not, treated with anything that would make it not organic. And you can give that to your certifier and that seems to work okay, but just kind of depends on your situation. So as a general rule, the harder the wood, the better for shiitake cultivation. It won't work at all on conifers and it won't really work at all on fruit trees or aromatic woods. So in addition to, white and red oak, bur oak, pin oak, swamp white oak, those have all worked for us. The ones that have the thicker bark seem to work better. So like we tried pin oak and it worked pretty well, but the bark's a little bit thinner on pin oak. Bur oak has worked really well. Swamp white oak has such thick bark that sometimes the mushrooms have trouble popping through. I don't think that's a reason not to use it. So if you had a good source of swamp white oak, go for it. But we did find that it was not ideal just because sometimes the mushrooms would get a little deformed trying to get through all that bark. You can definitely use poplar, cottonwood, willow to grow shiitakes, but I really don't recommend it. They're such light, soft woods. You only get a couple years of production out of them. The mushrooms usually come out a little pale. I really doubt they're as nutritious as growing on oak. So if you have a lot of those species that you really want to work with, go for it. But you might have better luck with those softer woods with something like an oyster mushroom. So there are basically 3 phases of cultivating shiitake. First, you inoculate, where you're going to, there are various ways of getting the spawn into the log, and that's inoculation. And then there's incubation, which is where you basically just let the log sit there in a cool, moist spot for 12 to 18 months. And then fruiting, where you would sort of rearrange the configuration of how the logs are stacked to allow more airflow. And generally, the logs will produce for 3 to 5 years, maybe up to 6 years. You can force your logs 3 times a year, spring, midsummer, and fall. You could probably force them as much as 5 times a year, but I don't recommend it. It's a good idea to let them rest in between fruitings. I've had some logs last 10 years, but that really isn't ideal. That was because I didn't have them in perfect conditions. And what you really want is for them to produce really well for about 5 years and then rot away to nothing so that there's space for more logs in your shade area. The drawback of using larger logs is they take longer to fruit, and then they last too long, and they take up valuable space, and they're heavy, and you're liable to hurt your back. So, so buy from a reputable spawn company. I like Easy Grow because I'm friends with the owner. Field and Forest is great. They're up in Wisconsin. They're certified organic. I've gotten spawn from them a lot. Fungi Perfecti has good spawn. They don't really have a lot of varieties of shiitake, so I like to like to choose what I'm going to get rather than just getting like the one variety they offer. But I did have good results with Fungi Perfecti's strain. Northwest Mycological Consultants has a really great, they have really good material as well. And Mushroom People down in Tennessee, that's actually where I first witnessed shiitakes being grown. And so Frank, the owner there, if he's still doing it, I haven't talked to him in a while. He's also a good source for spawn. There's plenty of other places in the country that are reputable and have good spawn. So there's just a short list of ones that I have experience with. Haven't had any problems with any of these folks at all. Now, these are what the plugs look like, and you'll notice that the spawn is sort of going along the grain, but it's not really growing between the grain. So that's an important lesson when you are inoculating your logs. The same thing applies. You kind of want to inoculate it in a diamond pattern because the mycelium will have trouble growing across the grain, but it grows along the grain pretty quickly. So yeah, so basically you would have like a line of points where you would inoculate, and then in the next row you would stagger it by a few inches. Does that make sense? Exactly, yeah, in a diamond pattern rather than them being right across from each other. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, 3 to 8 inches in diameter is the log size you're looking for. Some folks recommend 4 to 10 inches. I find a 10-inch log to be pretty heavy. So if I was going to do 10-inch logs, I would probably cut them 3 feet. I kind of like having 4-foot logs though. So I think I like the 3 to 8 inch diameter better. Yeah, 2 to 4 foot long is the recommendation. I don't usually cut them 2 feet long unless like there's some reason to cut it that short. Because you figure both ends of the log are sources of contamination. So you want to have, a slightly longer log is better to prevent contamination. Also, a lot of moisture comes out the sides of both ends of the log. And so the longer it is, the better it's going to retain moisture. And you want to have sort of even moisture throughout the log. And as I said before, you really want to cut the logs when they're dormant. And just make sure that like whatever you're comfortable lifting is the size that the logs are going to be. So there, I might recommend 3 feet, but if you're a small person, you might be like, these 2-footers are way more manageable for me. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And so. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so if you were just going to let the logs naturally fruit, they will generally fruit once in the spring and once in the fall, and that's about it. Or it might be that they fruit once in the spring and once in the summer and not in the fall. But usually you'll get maybe 2 flushes a year if you just let the rain do its thing. But if you force them, you can get 3 to 5 flushes a year. But it will definitely reduce the longevity of the log, but that can be desirable because you really want to keep moving through these logs and inoculating more. So it's a good idea to inoculate some every year if you can, so that you always have new logs coming along and some of them fading. So generally in the first in the first 2 or 3 years, you get about 75% of your yield. In those first couple of years of them fruiting. So that means 1.5 years of waiting, and then after that, those first few years is when you get your best production. The biological efficiency is the ratio of the fresh weight of the mushrooms to the initial dry weight of the substrate. So the maximum biological efficiency of shiitake production on logs is 33% of the dry weight of the log. So a 60-pound log with a 50% initial moisture content has a dry weight of 30 pounds, and so that can produce a maximum of 10 pounds over the lifespan of the log. So it's really your choice. Like, do you want to, if you want to force your logs quickly and get that 10 pounds out of that log, that's great. If you want to stretch it out and just let it naturally fruit, it's a lot less labor. You might get slightly less from the natural fruiting just because you can get more contamination the longer it sits there. But either way, you're never going to get more than that 10 pounds out of that log. But you can certainly get less. So generally yields on a per log basis, I hope to get about a half a pound per log each time they fruit, assuming that I'm going to get about 8 to 12 fruitings per log. You might see folks say, oh, you can get a pound every time. And I encourage you to try to get that. It really just depends on like how much energy you want to put into it, how perfect you want your conditions to be. With mushroom production, it's really like the more energy you put into it, the more you get out of it. But you can get quite a bit out of it with, not having to monitor them every day. So it does seem like the thin barked logs, it seems like they fruit a little earlier, but they just don't last as long. And it seems like the thick barked ones, they take a little longer to come into production. Question? Well, I first started doing this 20 years ago in the city, and half my backyard was logs. And so I was on city water. And when at first I didn't force them. I just did it naturally. And then at some point I decided, well, let's try forcing these things. And so I forced some with regular city water. In Ann Arbor, our water is treated with chloramine, and I was afraid it might damage the mycelium. It worked okay. But then I eventually got a chlorine filter for that. And so then whenever I would force, I would use the chlorine filter, and it worked about the same. I like to think that maybe I got better longevity out of the logs. But once we bought the farm, now we have well water. So now I'm doing it with a well. I haven't really tried it with rainwater, mainly just because I don't have a great catchment system. In the city, I didn't want to take the water off my roof because I didn't think it would be clean enough. And at the farm, we have plenty of water, and it's easy enough to get it out of the well. So, yeah. So if you want to measure the moisture content of your logs, then basically you're just going to make a slice 4 to 6 inches from the end of the log. And this is actually the reason why I don't like to do this, because it's not like I have about 2,000 logs. Some folks with big operations might have 10 or 20,000 logs. I don't know. I don't like to do much with the logs. I don't like to damage the logs. So taking a 4 to 6 inch slice off of it on a regular basis, I'm, taking a little bit off the log. So anyway, so you slice a 1 inch piece from the end, and just to get the drier part of that off of it, so that you're measuring really the center of the log. And then you'd put it in you'd weigh it and then put it in the oven at 175 overnight. And then you reweigh the slice and you figure out your moisture content. And the next slide shows the formula for that. So you really want your logs around 35% or between 35 and 50. If the moisture content goes below 25%, it can kill the mycelium. I haven't really had that happen too much, but we get rain here in the Midwest, so I would only be concerned about that in a drought situation. So in the spawn run, 35% is about where you want to be, but once you start fruiting them, they need to be wetter, so around 50 or 60%. So if you want your moisture content, it's a pretty easy formula. You just take your wet weight, subtract your dry weight, and then divide that by the wet weight times 100, and you have your log moisture content. So once you have the value, you can determine, whether you can see where you're at and whether you need to water your logs or not. And like I said, over many years, I've kind of figured out like I can just pick up a log, and go, oh, that's dry. I need to soak that one. And if you do force your logs on a regular basis, you're probably going to be forcing them every couple months, which is about right to keep them moist so that you're not going to like kill your mycelium. Question up there? Yeah, it's coming right up in the next few slides. So yeah, I will cover that. So let's see. I've never really had a bad batch of logs. I mean, I've had individual logs that didn't work well, but I've never gotten like a bad batch of spawn. I think in 20 years of doing this, maybe I had like one batch of 30 logs that never fruited. But for the most part, I've had success. And that's why I can confidently come up here and say, hey, this is a good sideline at your farm. You know, you're going to have some success if you just follow a few simple steps. I'm not as confident about a lot of the other mushrooms that you can do that. So for inoculation, usually you want a 3-person team. A 4-person team is even better. So you would take a bit that's 5/16. That's usually what size the dowels are made. And you would drill 1 inch deep. Usually you can, there's different bits you can get. There are some really nice bits that have a built-in stop on them. And they have a little barb on the tip. So as soon as you touch that drill bit to the log, it kind of sucks the bit in to the right depth, right up to the stop. And then most of your effort is pulling it out of the log. And you generally want to use around a 10,000 RPM drill. Well, not really a drill. I use a modified angle grinder. And Field and Forest, as well as some of the other shiitake companies, they sell this equipment. They sell these bits. So it's all pretty easy to source, just, from one company. And so you're going to space the holes 4 to 6 inches apart in rows running along the length of the log. And then you alternate the rows in a diamond pattern. And you want to space the rows about 2 inches apart. The more spawn you add to a log, the faster it's going to colonize, and the better it's going to keep out contamination. But you can certainly go the budget route and use less than the recommended amount of spawn. I don't recommend that, but you can do it if you feel like you want to save money or whatever. But spawn is generally cheap enough that you should just inoculate your logs fully. But yeah, you just put a dowel, one of these little 1-inch dowels up against the log, and you just whack it in with a hammer. And then after that, you cover up the hole with wax. I like to use beeswax just because I know it's a natural product. And the wax will help keep the moisture in the log as well as keeping contamination out of the log. Some folks in really dry climates, like in the desert, they may wax the ends of the logs to keep the moisture in there, but I don't think that's necessary in the Midwest. And wax is pretty expensive, so that would be a lot of wax per log. So I generally don't worry about that, especially if I'm going to be forcing and stuff. Question?
How thick would you layer the wax on?
Doesn't have to be very thick at all. This is like the process of inoculation is you want to keep moving. Like if you forgot to cover one plug, it's not the end of the world. You want to get this done quickly and efficiently and not add extra steps. At least if you want to make money doing this. And so yeah, they sell these little daubers. You could use a little paintbrush, whatever, but you just kind of want to go through and cover it up. So this is a team of 3 where you can see I've got my high-speed angle grinder, and then Evan there is waxing in the background, and Erica she's putting the plugs in the logs. You might notice that Erica has some funny things on her shoes. Often we get wax on our shoes while we're doing this. So that's why she has her shoes covered. If you have 4 people, then the 4th person will also do the plugging, and then every once in a while bounce back and forth to do the waxing. It generally only takes 1 person to do the drilling. So 1 person drilling, 1 to 2 people plugging, and then 1 or 2 people waxing. And that's an efficient group. And if you have more people, then just get more equipment and get 6 people and have 2 crews going. And then once you've put the wax on it, I use these metal aluminum tags that indicate the date that they were inoculated and the variety that I inoculated with, and possibly any other notes. Like, for example, if I want to keep track of what kind of wood I used, because sometimes I'll do some experimental types of wood to see if it worked. And I can tell you I haven't found anything that I haven't already told you, nothing surprising about what it will and won't work on. Let's see. So yeah, so as I said before, you'll want to use a high-speed angle grinder somewhere around 10,000 RPM. Oak is pretty hard wood, so it's nice to have that extra speed. A cordless drill does not work in oak very well at all. The bit will often get stuck and it's hard to pull out. So I've tried to find like a tree in the woods and fell it and inoculate it, and then I found that I really didn't have the electricity that I needed to inoculate the tree. So unless you have a way to generate power out in the woods or something, I don't really recommend that. It's nice to have the logs close by. You don't want them way off where you're not going to monitor them. You really want them someplace where you can easily look at them every day. Our farm's kind of wet, and so if I put them way back in the woods where they would probably fruit the best, at certain times of the year, if I had a big flush, I wouldn't be able to get them out of the woods because I can't drive a vehicle back there. And I don't want to, I don't want to schlep 50 or 100 pounds of mushrooms all the way back up to the house because it's kind of far. So you really want to place them someplace where it's easy to get to and you can monitor them because you only have a few days to pick them and you don't want to forget about them. There are ways of speeding up production. I have not tried them. There are automatic and semi-automatic inoculators, but one of the things I don't like about them is they're set up to use styrofoam capped plugs where it's like a plug and then there's a little bit of styrofoam on the top. And the idea there is that the styrofoam replaces the wax in keeping the moisture in and contamination out. But then, you do that and then you got like 1,000 logs and they all rot. And then let's see, you put about 50 plugs per whole 1,000 logs, you get 50,000 little pieces of styrofoam on your farm sitting on the ground then. So I'm not into styrofoam. I'm whole wheat, no nukes, all organic. So I really don't want to use styrofoam in my production method. But it's cool that they have, invented some ways of speeding up the process for large scale production. I look forward to them replacing the styrofoam with, some other substrate, some other product. I really like the plugs better than using sawdust spawn, mainly because all you need is a hammer. And you're not, it's a lot less wear and tear. If you do sawdust inoculation, the sawdust is cheaper, but it takes more labor. You have to drill a wider hole. So you need a bigger bit. The sawdust will sometimes fall out of the hole before you can get it waxed. But mainly the thing I don't like about it is that most of the inoculators are either thumb or palm inoculators. And, if you do, a lot of logs in a day, you're going to end up with either a bruise on your palm or your thumb's going to be sore for like a week or two afterwards if you're really doing a lot of logs. What I like about the plugs is all you need is a hammer. Anyone can do it. Just use a hammer. It's a lot less wear and tear. Let's see. So then, we talked about how long it takes. Generally about a pound of wax for 1,000 plugs. It seems like we can do about 6 to 7 logs per hour. If you can do it faster than that, let me know how. Because I'm just interested in greater efficiency, and if you can't figure out how to do it 6 to 7 logs per hour, then it's important to figure out why you're going so slow and what you need to figure that out and become more efficient. I'm happy to talk to you on the phone or something if you try this and you just can't figure out why it's taking so long. Again, it's important not to add extra steps. Don't use multiple strains in the same log because they'll compete with each other and then you won't get good results. So you always want to have all the same strain in one log. So if you run out of spawn in the middle of a log, you probably just want to leave it be. Let's see. Field and Forest sells a semi-automatic log inoculation tool. It's very expensive. But it can fill and seal 60 to 70 holes per minute, which is pretty cool. So the alternate inoculation kerf cut. This is, I haven't really tried this, but I just wanted to make you aware of it. It's where you would cut a slice into the log and then you would inoculate into that slice. So instead of doing like a surgical hole, you're like opening up more of it. Obviously, those aren't shiitakes; those are oysters. That's just the photo that I had available. You can also do a mushroom raft like this where you do it on the ground. I haven't tried this. I don't like the idea of this because I feel like you're going to get lots of contamination from the soil. So it's important to label each log. And now when you're incubating your logs after you inoculate them, you want to put them in these, what we call crib stacks. And you want to have less airflow, higher shade during this time. And so once you see the mycelium coming out the end of the log, you know that it's probably mostly inoculated. I think, yeah, so you see there that log, that one's ready to fruit. Like I said, about a year and a half, something like that. There's not a whole lot to the incubation process other than making sure that you're keeping them under 80% shade and out of the wind. And you may want to water them occasionally during that time because they need to be kept evenly moist. But then when you fruit them, it's good to have them leaning up against something. I use some pipes, some galvanized piping. And the idea here is that you want more airflow when they're fruiting, and when they do get wet, you want them to dry. So you put them on an angle like that so they'll actually dry. I've noticed that, and it's going to depend on your climate and your humidity and weather and the time of year, but if you get them a little lower to the ground on an angle, they stay a little moister. If you tilt them up a little higher, then you end up drying them out a little faster. And so if you're having trouble with contamination, like trichoderma contamination, then you can adjust that and you can make them a little drier. So then here's some mushrooms that are just forming. This is what my laying yard looks like. Not the whole thing, but that's what part of it looks like, just so you can see what the pipes look like. I just pound those into the ground and then lean the logs up against them. And then the way we force logs is we use these cattle troughs. And so we'll just fill those up with water, and I can fit about 30 or so logs in each one. So we have 3 cattle troughs, so I might do like 90 or so logs per week. One thing that's nice about forcing logs is you're not committed to forcing them. So we were forcing them for 10 years, every week for 10 years. And we would have good production for our restaurants and buyers and stuff. And then last year we were very understaffed. And so we decided, you know what, we're just not going to force the logs this year. And they fruited in the spring. And then we got a small bit in the summer. They fruited again in the fall. And all we had to do was pick them. We didn't have to do the backbreaking labor of moving the logs around. So what's nice about it is it is a flexible thing that you can do on your farm. It's nice that you can do your inoculations in the winter when maybe you're not as busy. And then all you really have to do in the summer is pick them if you're not forcing them. 24 to 48 hours. And I don't recommend leaving them in longer than that. They start to go anaerobic and smell pretty bad if you leave them in longer. And it's probably not good for them. So these are the labels. Let's see. So yeah, 24 to 48 hours. You really want to make sure that they're about 45% moisture content when you're done forcing them. And if they're not, then you can leave them in a little longer. But generally, 24 to 48 is just fine. I usually go 48 just to be on the safe side. If you have some logs that are kind of old and the bark is sort of half falling off, I don't recommend forcing those ones because as soon as the bark falls off, they're done. Basically what happens when they fruit is the whole log gets colonized, and then so you have this mycelium below the bark, and then they sort of build up pressure and then pop a piece of bark off, and then that's where the mushrooms come out. So the mushrooms don't always come out where you inoculate the log. They can come out of anywhere. But once that bark pops off, it's never going to fruit in that spot again. So once the log has no bark left, it's done. There's nothing left. So you always want to be really careful with the bark. So let's see. Yeah, so here's like a really nice fruiting. Like sometimes you just get a few mushrooms from a log, and sometimes you get a lot, and it's not very predictable. The one thing I love about, and one of the things I love and is very frustrating about growing mushrooms is there's a lot of mystery. You don't really know for sure why you might have had success one time. And so yeah, this is sort of like what you're going for when you have a good flush. Some people will knock over the logs, drop them, strike them with a mallet, hit them with some electricity, like to simulate lightning. A lightning strike can definitely stimulate mushroom production. And so, so I don't usually do these things, but when I have done them, I've found just anecdotally, slightly increased production. There have been some studies on the electrical forcing that show that it can sort of even up the ripening time of the mushrooms a little bit. It's kind of inconclusive. It seems like there needs to be more studies done on electrical stimulation of shiitakes. But I've heard of folks using a cattle prod to prod their logs, and that'll stimulate them to fruit a little bit more. I'm out of time, but I've also been asking some questions along the way, so I could either stop and answer people's questions, or I could just keep going, and you can interrupt me as you see fit. How does that sound? Keep going? Okay. So when you're harvesting your shiitakes, it's a good idea to either twist them off the log or cut them off with a knife. You don't want to pull them off because you could end up damaging some of the mycelium or pulling off some of the bark. I usually twist them because that way I don't have to have a knife with me that I'm going to end up losing or something. You can always twist them off and then cut them later. I don't even really bother to do that. I just twist them off, make sure they look clean, and then I just sell them. So yeah, here's another good fruiting. You can see these ones are lower to the ground, and they just really went off that time. So I've been playing around a little bit with different angles of the logs. If the humidity is low, lean them lower to the ground, and if the humidity is really high, need them to dry off, just put them up higher. So got some nice pictures of folks harvesting, and I think we already talked about the diseases and pests. Slugs are probably the worst. And then sometimes I'll get thrips in the gills. I haven't had a huge problem with fungal contamination. Generally, you want to always keep your logs in the shade so they never see the sun. But you don't want to keep them too moist in the shade. Question? Yes. Oh, yeah, sorry. Do I leave the logs outside all winter? Yes, I do everything outside. Some people do. I don't. I don't like to add extra steps. I think I could probably get better production if I did that. It is recommended to put them back in the crib stack for a little while to kind of let them rest and then put them back up. But God, that's a lot of moving logs around. It's one thing if you got 50 logs. I got 2,000 logs, you know. It's too much.
What about in the winter? Are you restacking them to kind of retain heat, or are they still?
You know, once they're inoculated, they don't really, I mean, between fruitings, it could be helpful, but like, no, if they're dormant in the winter, they're just frozen solid, they're fine. But I always keep shade cloth on them, even in the winter. In the summer, I have the shade cloth up on my structure, and then in the winter, I take the shade cloth off, so otherwise the snow would just break my structure, and I just put them right on the logs. And then as soon as I can in the spring, as soon as the weather's right, and I'm confident that there isn't going to be a big snowstorm, I'll put it back up. Someday I'll have a hoop house or something where it's easier to do that. Question? Generally, you don't want to go any more. The question was, how often can you force? So you don't want to force any more often than once every 2 months. You could probably do it about 5 times a year, but I don't recommend that because that's really pushing it. So, right. So sometimes you get lucky, and you'll have a situation where they'll fruit in the fall, but they'll just be like mushroom primordia, really small, and then they'll freeze solid, and then you'll get a January thaw or a February thaw. And if the mushrooms were small enough, you might get lucky and they might actually produce fruit. They might finish. But if the mushrooms got to a couple inches across it's probably going to end up making them rot a little bit when it does thaw. But yeah, I don't really force them in the winter. I mean, I've brought a few logs into the root cellar just to like, have some mushrooms to eat. I've tried a little bit of hoop house forcing, and I will try some more. I haven't quite figured that out. I got a lot of contamination the one winter that I tried it, and then it takes so much energy and time to inoculate these logs. I like to really take care of them. So I think I had brought 10 or 20 logs into the hoop, and they got like this funky fuzzy mold on the outside that couldn't have been good for the bark. And since the bark's the most important part, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to do this again. It's a lot of schlepping in and out of the hoop too. It's, in the snow. Sometimes winter, it's a good time to just take a break. Yeah. Oh yeah. Good question. Actually, that's just 2 slides ahead. So we'll just talk real quick about vitamin D, which is that mushrooms can absorb vitamin D. In particular, shiitakes can. They absorb more of it through their gills than through the cap. So what you can do is you can take your mushrooms and put them gills up in the sun for a while, and they will basically convert to vitamin D. But you do have to be careful if you do that, because you could end up overdosing on vitamin D if you ate too many. So interesting thing to know, but be careful how you use that knowledge. So yeah, for storage, as quickly as you can, you want to cool them down, especially on a hot summer day. You really want to store them as close to 32 degrees as you can. You don't want them you don't want them to freeze, but they will generally last about 3 weeks in the refrigerator at 33 or so. For every hour that they're, especially if it's like a hot day, for every hour that they're not refrigerated, you're going to lose a day of storage. So it is really important to get them cooled off as soon as possible. Even though they'll last 3 weeks, I usually don't like to bring them in and sell them to someplace after about 7 to 10 days, just because I'd hate to sell them to someone and then within a couple or a few days they might start to turn color or whatever. But they really last a long time in the fridge. And really, if you're just using them for home use, they'll just, if they're stored properly, they'll desiccate instead of rotting. And so then you just end up with some dried mushrooms in the fridge, as long as they're not too tightly packed. If you put them really, pack them together in a box, then they'll probably rot. But a few here or there, I generally, if I'm going to store them in the fridge, I like to use wax paper. So if I'm going to put them in a box, I line the bottom of the box with wax paper and the top of the box with wax paper. I don't really do much in the middle because I want it to breathe a little bit. Wax paper is perfect, really, because it breathes a little bit, lets a little bit of the moisture out, but it keeps the mushrooms in good shape for up to 3 weeks. So if I'm not using a box, if I'm just collecting mushrooms in the field, or if I'm gonna just give some or sell some off the farm to a friend or customer, and it's a small amount, I'll just wrap it up in some wax paper, give it to them in wax paper. And that really is the best way to store them, is in wax paper. Don't store them in plastic, or they'll just get slimy and gross. So the same rules apply in organic production as any other organic production. The logs have to be from organically maintained land. The spawn has to be certified organic. The wax has to be organic or non-synthetic. You can use beeswax, which is what I use. You could also use, a soy-based cheese wax, that sort of thing. You probably want to avoid paraffin wax for it. I think I heard that some folks were able to get through the certification process after using paraffin, but I don't like the idea of using petroleum products near my food. And then, of course, no synthetic pesticides. There's not really a whole lot that you would do in terms of pesticides with shiitakes anyway. You don't have that many pest problems. Let's see. So if you're going to get your logs from someone else's land, if you can have the landowners sign a form just saying that nothing's been used on the land that would prohibit it from being certified organic. covered that. So then, so production quantity. So if you're going to just grow them for a hobby or for your family, probably somewhere between 50 and 100 logs is good for a family of 4 for the year. So that assumes that you're going to like eat them when they're fresh, and maybe you're going to dry or freeze some or whatever. That's a good amount. You'll have plenty. If you're homesteading and you want a lot and maybe a little bit to sell, somewhere between 100 and 500 logs is a good amount for homesteading. If you want a small part-time business, probably in the 1,000 to 2,000 logs range. That's where I'm at, and that's where I've been for quite a while. I probably make usually over $5,000 a year off my shiitake operation, and I don't think I've never hit 10,000. And I certainly could if I put more energy into it. But as I explained at the beginning of the lecture, we do so many things at our farm, and this is just like one of many things we do. So someday I may scale this up. I mean, for a while there, it was my dream to scale up to a small full-time business of about 10,000 logs. But those logs are heavy, and I'm not getting younger, so I'm like, maybe about 1,000, 2,000 is about where I want to be. We'll see. We'll see how the seed business takes off. Sorry, I didn't change the slide. I should have said in Iowa. And my prices, when I first started, I was getting 12 a pound. And then I slowly raised the price to about 15 a pound. And then when we moved to the farm and got certified organic, I raised the price to $16.50 a pound. And I'm getting that. I mostly sell to chefs. There's also in our town, there are some places that we can sell produce on consignment to a store, and we get 75% of the price. So we set the price. So in that situation, I sell quarts, which I weigh to about 1/5 of a pound. And I sell those for $5 a piece. So if you do the math, that's $25 a pound. Of course, we're giving them 75% of that. So you can get a pretty good price for these. You do have to sell it a little bit because it's important to know that people like chefs and grocery stores, they're able to buy sawdust grown shiitakes that are widely available commercially for somewhere on the order of $3 to $7 a pound wholesale. But they're being grown on sawdust that's like glued together with sugar and some nutrients and then put in a plastic bag and grown basically in a cave or a lab type situation. They're okay to eat. They still taste like shiitakes, but they really don't have quite the flavor, or probably, can't say this for sure, but probably not the nutrition of a naturally grown log either. I have had chefs tell me, your mushrooms might be twice the price, but they have 3 times the flavor. And then every time I call them and say I have mushrooms, they say, we'll take them. I got 20 pounds, we'll take them. I got 50 pounds, we'll take them. Sometimes I get we'll have a bumper crop and have 100 pounds. And they say, we'll take them. So these log grown shiitakes are really valuable, and you should never let people undersell you, because it's just a lot of labor to do this. So you don't want to waste them. Now that said, if you go someplace when you're first getting started and someone says, well, I'll give you half of what you're asking, just walk away. You got to get the price. You have to get these high prices if you're going to do all this labor. So you might, those first few years, if you get a few crops that you're not quite ready for and don't have a market for, you might just end up having to, well, not necessarily throw them in the compost pile, but give them away to friends and family. You can cook them halfway and freeze them. You can put them in the food dehydrator. There's lots of things you can do. Obviously, if access to a commercial kitchen, then you can really do some value added stuff, and that's the direction that I think I'd like to head. Let's see. I think I just covered a lot of that. Let's talk about shiitake grading. So in this country, basically you've got #1 premium grade, and then which still have the enrolled margin on the edge of the cap, and then you've got your #2 caps, which are fully expanded. But there's not a huge difference in price. Those are generally graded, those are usually the commercially available, really cheap sawdust grown ones. But there is another grade, which would be that people haven't really talked about, which is if you can grow really large shiitakes, like portobello sized. I mean, wouldn't a portobello burger be sort of obsolete if you could have consistently get like a shiitake burger at a restaurant, which has so much more nutrition and protein. I personally find that portobello burgers are, while they taste okay, they're kind of bland, they're not very satisfying. But if you eat a big shiitake like that, you're going to be satisfied. There's some protein in there. So there's not a whole lot of grading that's done in this country, but in Japan and China and other Asian countries, they pay a lot more attention to different grades. There's basically 3 grades. There's donko quality, which is generally used for dried mushrooms, and there's koshin and koko. And I'll give you some examples of these with pictures. So this is donko quality with the cracked caps, and this is considered the highest quality. These will sell for like 3 times the price in Japan. The reason this happens is usually happens in the spring. It can happen other times of the year, but it fairly consistently happens in the spring where they've been waiting all winter to produce. And so when they do produce, they just produce like gangbusters, and they grow so fast. And maybe in the afternoon, the humidity goes down, and they're just growing so fast that they just crack. The caps crack, and they're very beautiful. And I think that part of the reason that they're worth more is just because they're so beautiful. And then these are the ones that will often be used for dried mushrooms, especially the ones that you see imported from China. So then you've got the koshin, which is a fully expanded cap with thin flesh, longer stems. Whoops, sorry. So those ones would probably be called koshin quality. And then the koko quality would be intermediate quality with thick flesh, but no cracking or in-rolled margins. And this is really most of what you'll see on the market. This is an important one. So mushroom sensitivity and allergies. So fortunately, I'm not allergic to shiitakes, but some people are. I've definitely had some friends that I've fed shiitake and they became violently ill. So you have to be careful. If you've never eaten a certain species of mushroom before, it's a good idea to just try like a small cooked piece the size of, say, a nickel or so, and then just wait an hour and see if you have a bad reaction. So it turns out I'm sensitive to quite a few mushrooms: chicken of the woods, honey mushrooms, including Entomoma abortivum, which parasitizes honey mushrooms, giant puffballs, wheat lacoche or corn smut. All those things, I have trouble with them. Mostly the symptom for me is I get swollen glands, but some people could have more severe violent reactions than that. People often ask me why I don't grow oyster mushrooms. They're only worth about 1/3 of what shiitakes are. They're definitely pretty easy to grow, but after doing some research, I realized that in Asia, where they have these huge mushroom farms, these huge oyster farms, often the workers will develop an allergy to the spores, and sometimes they'll even develop like serious lung problems from the spores. So, I haven't heard as many reports about that with shiitake, but you should be careful. And this is one of the reasons why I generally have done this outside and haven't moved into a lab or like an indoor fruiting house. Doesn't mean I won't in the future, but just be careful. Don't expose yourself to too many spores or too many mushrooms all at once. Give yourself a breather in between. And you really need to educate your customers about allergies, as well as making sure that all mushrooms should be properly cooked before being eaten. So remember that shiitakes are edible for most people, most of the time, when properly cooked. How am I doing on time? It's time? Okay. I think we got it. Yeah. I think there's all kinds of other mushrooms that you basically do the same way. Chicken of the woods, hen of the woods. Namikos can be used on cherry logs. Reichis can be done on logs as well. A lot of these I don't have a lot of experience with, so it's if you have questions, I'm not sure if I can answer a lot of them. And if you want to make a spore print, you just take a cap, remove the stem, put it on a black piece of paper with like a glass over it, wait a little while, and when you remove the mushroom from the black piece of paper, you'll see what color the spores are. So that's a very important way to identify mushrooms. And I don't think we need to review the steps. Here's some nice chicken of the woods on the right, and maitake or hen of the woods up top there. This white one is Hericium or lion's mane. Yeah. Any other questions? Because I think that's all the gist of it. Thank you.